Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Carla Coppell. I'm Managing Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. We're honored to be hosting this side event in conjunction with the 4th International Conference on Small Island Developing Nations. Today, we're here to discuss the very important issue of how to address data gaps for equitable climate finance and loss and damage fund distribution, a super important issue as we confront increasing vulnerability in small island states as a result of climate change. We have a wonderful panel to talk about this from a range of different perspectives. I don't want to waste too much time before diving in, but we have with us Paola Ridolfi, who's a climate advisor with the World Bank. In that role, she leads World Bank's technical positioning for the Conference of the Party and coordinates strategic priorities across the World Bank in dialogue with a wide range of partners. We also have Tahila Maloney, who's co-chair of the Caribbean Development Bank Fund Future Leaders Network. Great to have you here, Tahila. And finally, third but not least, Dr. Marissa Ensor, who is a senior climate research fellow with the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Marissa, it's lovely to be here and to have you with us today. I know you are traveling to the conference itself subsequently, so people can then meet you live and in person in addition to this side event. The way we're going to organize the conversation this morning, I'm going to ask some initial questions of our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. If you have questions, please put those in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we will turn to that after we finish the initial presentations. I'm going to start with you, Paola. Tell us a bit about how the World Bank is thinking about climate finance and the way that it reaches vulnerable people. Talk a little bit about what the priorities are today and moving forward.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you for having me in this really interesting panel. And thanks to the Georgetown Institute on Women, Peace, and Security. It's a pleasure to be here. So first of all, let me tell you that the seeds are really the most affected of all populations globally by climate change. And climate finance, particularly in adaptation, becomes essential not only to counter the impact of climate change, but also to start building differently and planning development differently. So the seeds are really where we see the direct interlinkages between climate and development. And that's where the World Bank comes in as the largest and most important financier of climate finance and development globally, particularly in lower income countries. What the World Bank does in climate finance operate at different levels. So globally, we are obviously part of the overall UN effort to support a higher ambition towards a new the NCQG, the new climate, the new goal on climate finance. Second, we are in the process of discussing the new IDA replenishment. IDA finances the lower income countries, and it is central in this context to discuss climate as part of development. At the macro level, we're also raising the ambition on lowering the cost of borrowing. That is the biggest obstacle to financing climate, particularly for seeds. And our president, Ajay Banga, has been working very closely with Prime Minister Mia Mottley to introduce a lower cost of debt measures and new instruments. At the project level, more at the community level, we are raising the ambition, particularly on adaptation financing and targeting of communities to benefit from climate finance. Thank you. Over to you, Carla.
Thanks so much. That's super interesting and important. I know that, the World Bank is often working at the national government level and in partnership with national governments to enable financing. And one of the toughest challenges is then how you reach the most vulnerable, the most marginalized. What steps can be taken to make climate finance more accessible to local communities and vulnerable groups, both from the World Bank perspective and then the advice that you would give others who are making financial resources available for adaptation?
Thank you. So first of all, let me just go more into a little bit of the details. In terms of adaptation, the portion of climate financing of the World Bank that has gone to climate finance is, and in particular to adaptation, is the largest for the seeds countries. So we have managed to really raise the bar there. Just to give you a sense, the World Bank finances measures climate co-benefits, which means that we are measuring the contribution to climate of every dollar financed in every country. And the adaptation share of these climate co-benefits is on average globally 46% of total climate financing. For the seeds, it is 65%. So adaptation is really at the center of every dollar that the World Bank provides in grants or loans, and mainly grants. 65% of this financing means over $2 billion globally for all the 39 seeds. So in terms of access to resources, we're actually stepping up. Moving forward for the next year at COP28, the World Bank raised the ambition of climate financing from the current average adaptation and mitigation of 39% of total financing to 45%. So we expect that for the seeds, there will be even additional resources available. And particularly, we will continue in particular to focus on adaptation and continue to maintain this predominance of adaptation financing for the seeds. What can be done at country level to make this financing more available? As I mentioned, the first obstacle is really to provide resources that come in at low cost. So in order to allow development planning for climate at community level in a feasible and long-term sustainable way, the World Bank has worked with Prime Minister Mia Mottley and announced globally that we will be broadening the scope of the debt pause clauses. That means that interest rates on loans contracted for the impact to counter the impact of climate change for reconstruction after natural disasters will be paused for countries affected. Mainly, these are seeds countries. So there will be a pause on interest payments. There will be also an enabling of fees to be covered by concessional resources. So a scheme whereby we come in and subsidize for countries to borrow. That's the first element, because in the end, it's not the community that has to borrow, it is the government. So we need to enable the government to access these resources at a more accessible way. This new initiative was the Climate Resilient Debt Clauses was announced at COP28 by President Ajay Banga. We're also at a more sort of granular level, we work with countries on the basis of country development reports that take climate into account. So climate reports that help countries plan for their NDCs. That help countries put resources where they're most needed to anticipate where the impact of climate can be, do planning in a way that to minimize future natural disasters and also to build back after natural disasters. The CCDRs, these reports, have a lot of analytical content to them. So what we bring is really the analysis of what the climate and disaster risks are in every part of each country at community level in particular, so that we come in and with these climate and disaster risk screenings, we can anticipate which communities will be most affected and enable a planning in every city, in every community that takes climate into account. There are many more analytical products that we bring that allow sort of development to take climate into account at the more granular level. We also have the largest portion of our financing and projects in seeds going to social development projects urban development projects, coastal projects that take the climate into account. So there is also a sectoral selection that is discussed and decided by each country that ends up actually benefiting those communities that are most, and also safeguards framework that aims at doing no harm, of course, but also facilitating the involvement of communities and particularly women in communities in the decision-making process of where the projects are going to take place. So these are different levels of interventions, and I could elaborate more, but broadly from the macro global to the micro, the project to the community level. Thank you. Over, Carla.
Paola, thanks so much. And I really appreciate you talking not only about funds distribution, but also about the planning process, and not only about the vulnerability and need to adapt and fund those who are vulnerable, but also bring their voices into decision processes. So thank you so much for that overview. Now we'll turn to Tehila Maloney. It's wonderful to have you with us, Tehila, and we're eager to hear your view, particularly from the ground. So talk to us, please, a little bit about how small island developing states are uniquely affected by climate change, and in particular, what you think the data gaps are that inhibit the kind of focus on vulnerable and marginalized populations.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm already here in Antigua for the SIDS conference. So it's a bit crazy right now, but I'm so happy to kind of be having this dialogue whilst I'm interacting with the youth and whilst we're here getting that live information. However, a lot of the dialogues that we're having even here lack the necessary information for it to be consequential and sustainable. Today, I think that this falls within the realm of three major points. I think it affects our health and health infrastructure. I think it affects culture, and I think it really affects migration and migration patterns, migratory patterns, all these different things. What connects these three ideas is the idea that we lack data. So for instance, when we talk about health and health infrastructure, we have things like rising temperatures, increasing airborne and mosquito-borne diseases amongst Caribbean nations. But because the information is being collected in silos, we find that we're unable to collate it in a way that helps not just one particular island or one particular small island territory, but it's able to help territories at large, and not just the Caribbean, but also the EIS and the Pacific. And we can really see that data transfer knowledge, so everybody does not have to build from the ground up, because coming from SIDS, we know that we're also economically vulnerable, and having to always start from the ground is not the best way for us to do it. And many of us do not have the resources to do as such. So for instance, a study done in Jamaica found that they had a particular percentage of dengue cases due to rising sea levels and different things. But when they did a similar study in Guadeloupe, they came to the same conclusion. And then a similar study in Puerto Rico, it came to the same conclusion. Even though the recommendations were different, it was a study that did not, the distance did not require that study to be done across those different territories. And when we talk about heritage as well, we're talking about those big data gaps in terms of how climate change is affecting our built heritage, how it's affecting our cultural heritage, and how it's affecting our natural heritage. As small island developing states, we depend on our built heritage. It's our beaches, it's our forests, it's everything around us. And we're unable to kind of capture that because we think of these things outside of the realm of development. So we're not monitoring them. We may be conserving them, but we're not actually looking at the impact of climate change on these within the long term. So it's really hampering the way that we can interact with our natural heritage and hampering our ability to protect them and even create new sustainable ways to provide livelihoods for persons who gain from it. And then when we also talk about our built or cultural heritage, we talk about the loss of place-based heritage or place-based history. So even in Trinidad and Tobago, we have rising sea levels closing in on communities, meaning that communities that are on the islands, on the coast, near forests, and they're dependent on the natural heritage or the built heritage, they're unable to gain those resources. So persons are migrating. We find that in natural disasters, there's loss of life, and basically there's a loss of heritage. And as islanders, those are actually the heritage. That is the heritage that we depend on. And whereas we do have inland heritage, those are normally concentrated within urban areas where it doesn't really facilitate this sort of development of history. It's more for business. It's when people come to our countries, when they come to our territories, they're coming to those particular places. And it's just so ironic that we're not focusing our efforts on those places, even though they uphold the majority of our economic and non-economic heritage, economy, everything. So we have those particular points. I think the last thing was also migration. So those same communities, those same vulnerable communities, the same data gaps that are affecting both their heritage and everything else and their health, it's also affecting the way that we calculate remittances and the things that migration brings, because they have the highest rates of migration. They also have the highest rates of remittances. Now, remittances is very serious, especially within the Caribbean. It actually makes up 15% of Jamaica's GDP. So we find that we have this large amount of economic resources being poured into these communities to benefit them or to support them in non-economic ways, but they are unable to kind of measure what that looks like or the impact on that on those communities, and therefore they're not able to shape the discussion or shape the dialogue as to how these persons could use some of that money being sent back to them to build their communities. So that's some of the data gaps that we're seeing within this space.
Thanks so much. Super important observations and mesh perfectly with some of the analyses that Marissa has been doing. So Marissa, let me bring you into this conversation. How can we think about non-economic loss and damage and consider that when we're figuring out how to manage a loss and damage fund and the fair distribution of resources?
All right, well, thank you for that question. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be in conversation with my fellow panelists and with all of you in the audience. And I will be traveling to Antigua for the SEEDS conference tomorrow. So I very much look forward to meeting Tehila in person, who is already there, as well as any of you who might be coming to the conference as well. All right, so I'm going to elaborate a bit on some of the points that Tehila has already alluded to. So imagine the following scenario. An island community has to relocate because climate change-induced sea level rise has rendered their land uninhabitable. What are some of the changes that the community faces? Well, not only are fisheries lost, but also ocean-based cultural traditions. Not only is arable land abandoned, but also culturally meaningful landmarks, such as sacred places, religious structures, and burial sites. Not only are new ways of income generation learned, but old ways of knowing and relating to the environment may also be lost. Consider, for instance, the loss of identity in communities of fishers and farmers that find themselves dislocated from their seas and lands. The task of having to adapt to new realities is likely to cause stress, a sense of loss, disorientation, and may even challenge social cohesion, exacerbate tensions, and undermine people's resilience to future shocks and stressors. Well, these are all examples of non-economic loss and damage. Now, the damages caused by climate change can be divided into economic losses and non-economic losses, although, of course, there's a great overlap between the two. Now, neither the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, nor the Paris Agreement has provided a formal definition of loss and damage. The Paris Agreement simply recognizes the importance of, and I quote, averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. the UNFCCC on its part states that loss and damage generally refers to the impacts of climate change that exceed households and communities' ability to adapt. LND is currently recognized as the third pillar of international climate change governance in recognition that certain impacts are now unavoidable despite adaptation efforts, and that these damages are distributed inequitably, making the issue a matter of climate justice. Now, while countries in the global north have contributed most to global warming, those in the south, including cities, are suffering the worst consequences. Economic losses and damages are those affecting resources, goods, and services that are commonly traded in markets, such as damage to property, critical infrastructure, or supply chain disruptions. Non-economic losses would include loss of life, health impacts or losses due to forced displacement, loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, loss of territory, cultural heritage, and indigenous or local knowledge, and other threats to cultural survival. As such, social and cultural losses are just as important as material losses in generating social resilience and enabling recovery. It is on the basis of common identity and values that people come together to organize on behalf of their communities. This is a core principle behind the concept of resilience. So failing to account for these non-economic losses means that they could elude policy attention and lead to inefficient decision-making and even perpetuate social injustices. Without explicit efforts to assess these kinds of losses, policymakers may have a myopic view of both impacts and solutions. On the other hand, many forms of non-economic loss and damage cannot be easily recorded using readily available units. Standardized measurements exist for some items, such as health, but others have not been subject to systematic assessments. In particular, non-material, non-economic losses and damages pose significant challenges to quantification. Tools other than traditional economic cost-benefit analysis need to be explored to support proper decision-making. In particular, given the context dependence of their value, future institutional arrangements should not rely only on static assets of non-economic loss and damage items. The failure to adequately address non-economic losses is likely to have serious consequences, as these losses have the potential to fundamentally undermine a community's resilience to current and future impacts. So to survive and thrive in a world characterized by extremes, such as the one we're living in, we need to mitigate and account for these non-economic losses, including our sense of place, as Tehila alluded to, cultures and traditions, as this will better allow us to absorb shocks and bounce back as a community. The UNFCCC needs to systematically take these facts into consideration and channel them to international decision makers to inspire the ambition urgently needed to mitigate the climate crisis.
Thanks so much, Marissa. Tehila, I'd love to go back to you for a moment and hear a little bit what your views are about the risks of undervaluing these kinds of non-economic values that you talked about, culture, migration, loss of natural environment. How do you place a value on those, and what's the risk of undervaluing them? Oh, maybe we have a problem with Tehila's signal. While we wait for Tehila to come.
Sorry about that. I didn't hear the question clearly.
Oh.
You
So sorry. What I'm asking is what you think are the risks of not bearing in mind or not factoring in non-economic loss and damage sufficiently. What do you think the result of that may be?
It's unimaginable. I think there is no part of island life that will remain unaffected. Everything, life as we know it, would sort of cease to exist. So to kind of culminate that in a statement is very difficult for me at this time, because in reality, yes, we measure development economically, but the economic serves the non-economic, which is the actual way that we live our lives and we execute who we are as island people. I think one of the biggest factors that we have to consider is that loss of life, especially as we move into more violent wet and dry seasons and move into more violent hurricane seasons. Last year, for instance, there was in communities that had never had flooding before, there was almost 8 feet of water in their houses. Like, people were able to use boats to go from house to house, and these are areas, that communities that we don't know historically to have flood. This year they're expecting something very similar, and it is quite a scary scenario. We can't plan simple things as birthday parties at that part of the year. So I think there's an emotional aspect of it. There is a psychological aspect of it. It affects our education, our educational systems, the way students are able to go to school. It affects persons' ability to go to work and earn a livelihood. It affects the reach is far and wide. If you can think about the way that you live your life right now, think about those islands on the front line and think that life as we know it again will cease to exist. I know it's a bit dramatic, but it's our current reality.
No, I think it's really important to paint that kind of a vibrant spotlight. I mean, it's really fundamental. I know that Paula needs to leave us in a couple of minutes, but before you go, Paula, I wonder if you could comment from the World Bank's perspective a little bit on this question of non-economic loss and damage and how it should be factored into planning, into distribution of resources, into the thinking of the World Bank lending portfolio going forward.
Thank you, Carla. And really, I mean, I wouldn't add anything more than what Tahila has said. She knows it directly firsthand. As you know, the World Bank has been entrusted with hosting the interim loss and damage fund and the secretariat, and the board has been appointed. So we're waiting for the process of the board appointed by the countries to make these decisions. In terms of the World Bank own financing, again, focusing on adaptation has an intrinsic focus on the impact of climate and loss and damage. I would also like to refer to the fact that there are ongoing discussions on the NCQG at UN level that pertain to whether loss and damage should be included as a component of the NCQG. So I would rather leave to the UN system and to the countries that will make decisions about the new fund for loss and damage to integrate these decisions, which are going to be very important. But the bank will continue to work strongly on adaptation to address these damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really important message to take back, and we really appreciate your willingness to do so and to place a premium on the kinds of impacts that Tahila and Marissa are talking about. Marissa, let me circle back to you. There's another dimension of this, which is sort of what is the analytical framework we use to think about loss and damage considerations. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why a gendered perspective becomes important when you're undertaking this kind of analysis. And before you answer, I just want to remind the audience, we very much want to open up this conversation for your questions so that we can be engaging with you around the issues you find most important. So please do use the question function to submit your questions. We're eager to involve you in the conversation. Marissa, please go ahead.
Well, yes. I could actually answer that question with one sentence by saying that gender considerations are always critical in any kind of endeavor that involves human beings. But to answer in a way that is more specific to the topic at hand, we need to remember that climate change induced losses and damages are affecting and will continue to affect everyone, but not equally. Women and girls, particularly those from cities, as well as those from the global south, maybe living in marginalized rural communities, well, they bear the least responsibility for greenhouse emissions. They are, however, experiencing the worst impacts of the climate crisis and suffering the greatest losses and damages. Yet, despite recent gains, the loss and damage discourse remains dominated by technical and policy discussions held in spaces largely controlled by men. Over 80% of the people currently displaced by climate-related events are women and girls. Women, especially across the global south, are hugely impacted due to the structural inequalities they face, in large part owing to the prevalence of women's unpaid care and domestic work. Because their contribution to the economy and society are not always measured in monetary terms, women are more prone to be economically and politically marginalized. Then we have cultural norms that give men and boys priority, which means that women, girls, and gender diverse peoples face greater risks of hunger and lack of shelter, education, and employment opportunities. Their resilience, their ability to predict and come and recover from the impact of environmental extremes is then compromised. Okay? They often end up trying to find jobs in urban settings where they can only work as domestic workers, often undocumented, most vulnerable to abuse, and without any legal protection. Disaster relief and post-disaster rehabilitation setups often increase gender dimensions of violence and social injustice and prevent them from gaining income security and social protection. Women are also often refused access to land and assets ownership after a disaster hits, once again, compromising their ability to recover their resilience. Financial support schemes often lead to an increase of discriminatory practices and to increase indebtedness of women. It is especially women and girls who face a high risk of being trafficked or sexually abused in post-disaster settings, either because of no protection systems, if there are no shelters, or the shelters are not properly monitored, or because they have to leave their homes in order to survive. However, just as women and girls are most impacted by the ecological devastation of the climate crisis, they're also leading on climate action. And their participation in all aspects of decision-making in relation to how loss and damage is addressed, averted, and minimized, and more broadly, in any climate-related decision-making is thus fundamentally important. Okay? The structural barriers to women's access to participation need to be abolished. There's still a lot of room for improvement in data collection and analysis around loss and damage, which often ignores or marginalizes gender disaggregated data collection efforts. Hence, assessing the gender dimensions of loss and damage related data, including a way of raising women's voices in this field, is critical. As I said, again, there is a need to collect more disaggregated data in order to more precisely map in gender just ways the disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis and related needs, as well as women's ability to contribute to finding equitable and effective and sustainable solutions. Women's leadership in this and all other aspects of climate change and negotiations must be promoted, as evidence suggests that higher women's representation in high-level governance structures tends to lead to the adoption of more effective climate change and security policies. It is also imperative to identify ways to enhance gender equality by, for instance, assessing gender differentiated impacts of climate change, highlighting the role of women and marginalized groups in climate action, and ensuring gender responsive means of implementation. just want to conclude by saying that by promoting women's leadership, including socially just and gender transformative measures, and including women from climate vulnerable communities in the discussion, we can much more effectively lead the way to climate justice worldwide.
Thanks so much, Marissa. I want to, Tahila, if you're willing to comment on this as a young woman leader facing the challenge of how you bring in different perspectives in the discussion on the ground. I wonder whether you see an acknowledgement of how climate change is and will continue to affect different populations differently. Are you frustrated? Do you feel heard? Tell us a little bit about your experience.
I think that I completely support everything that was just said, especially in terms of gender and certain intersectional populations. So as she said, women continue to be the most educated about climate change, the ones on the forefront, the ones who are committed to doing the work. However, other disparities, whether cultural or historical, continue to keep us as well as the most vulnerable population. So we find that sorry about that. We find that women and persons with disabilities within the Caribbean are disproportionately affected, in that women, they are currently making so many amendments for instance, fishermen, because that's male dominated. However, fishmongering is woman dominated or female dominated, or, but there's no accommodations being made for how rising sea levels affect them. We find that women are more likely to live in economically vulnerable communities, single parents, all this, and there are accommodations being made for other communities, but none in those communities where women are currently being housed and are currently being affected by the climate crisis. And of course, because we have not had those conversations about really integrating both persons with disabilities within our society, they become even more marginalized, as we have to amend our infrastructure to kind of fit what's happening. For instance, if we're building houses on stilts and we're talking about persons in wheelchairs, how does that affect them? How are we ensuring that they're also able to come with us on this journey as we change our livelihoods? We also have this that they aren't acknowledged. So we find that they are also living on the outskirts of society, and they do not have access to the information or the privileges or the amenities needed to be successful in adapting to what's happening on the ground within the territory that they currently reside. So it's quite a unique situation that we are facing, but the solutions aren't necessarily there. The conversations are sort of happening, but the voices that we need in those conversations aren't present. And therefore, as I said in the beginning, they're not having sustainable conversations about it. And it is very, very frustrating to witness.
Thank you so much for those comments. I think those examples of how roles differ and therefore vulnerabilities differ are so important. They really make the conversation concrete in terms of the ways that climate change plays out and affects different communities differently. I wanted to turn to the first question that's been put into the chat. And I want everybody to comment on this because you all touch on formal processes. But Paula, if you could weigh in first, I'm curious, the question is about whether this gap in data and the differentiation among different groups and how the loss and damage fund will be structured. Are these discussions being acknowledged in high-level formal discourse? How are we confronting the data gaps that exist and that need for differentiation as we move forward with planning and implementation? Oh, maybe we've lost our signal with Paula. Well, if that's the case, then Marissa and Tahila, I would love your observations on whether we think these discussions are gaining traction within formal settings.
Okay, I can offer a few comments. I think that something that is critical here is recognizing the need to build bridges between high-level, macro-level kinds of discussions, such as those taking place at the World Bank and with the UNFCCC, those kinds of institutions, as well as community-level kind of understandings that are based on people's lived experience. So the question was about data gaps. And while I do believe that there's still a lot of information that we need to gather in order to respond in a manner that is more reflective of the actual situation, I think that part of the problem is that the various stakeholders are not always speaking with each other effectively. And Paola did mention some of it in her initial interventions. We have much more information on the more quantifiable dimensions of loss and damage, simply because that is what we have been doing. It is perhaps easier to collect that kind of information, but that results in almost exclusively technocratic approaches that, as all of us have highlighted, don't really cover the wide range of the losses and damages that are being created by the negative impacts of climate change. And so what would be really needed is, and we've heard this expression in many other contexts, we need to demolish silos to work in a more collaborative, transdisciplinary kind of way, to recognize that in order to understand the various dimensions of loss and damage, we need different kinds of expertise, not focus so exclusively on the quantifiable dimensions, and incorporate the voices of the people on the ground who already have the data, perhaps not structured in the kind of ways that those of us who are working from behind the desk are accustomed to managing, but nobody knows better than what they need at the people who are going through it. Remember Paola mentioning these country development reports that are already being produced by countries that they typically or they may, not typically, perhaps that's overstating it, but they may include risk analysis, vulnerability analysis, as well as the interventions that are already being put in place as part of their climate action. But they tend to focus on disaster risk reduction from a typically very technocratic approach. With recognizing that this is absolutely critical, I think that we need to expand our understanding of the kinds of losses and damages that people experience, because as all three of us have highlighted, the non-economic, sometimes non-monetized dimensions of loss and damage are just as important, if not more important, as components of people's ability, people's resilience, people's ability to recover from the impacts of climate change that are likely to become increasingly frequent and increasingly severe. So to summarize, building more bridges between the various levels, the macro level, the micro level, high-level community grassroots, more transdisciplinary, and more recognition that people's experience in the climate crisis go way beyond what is easily quantifiable and what we have been accustomed to including in these kinds of reports. I'll leave it there.
Great. That's a great menu for action. I appreciate it. Tahila, I want your observation on whether you think these issues are being taken seriously at policy levels, but I want to add one small component onto your answer, which is, for folks who are listening, what would your advice be to them for how to advocate for these things to be taken more seriously, to be incorporated into decision making?
So I love the question because it really introduces us to a conversation about data justice. So for instance, saying that there's not enough data is easy to say. Saying that we need more data is easy to say, but saying who needs to be collecting this data, who needs to be framing the way in which the data is collecting, who needs to be defining the terms within which we're going to be collating this information, and who needs to have access to the information is a discussion I am not seeing at a very high level, especially in terms of loss and damage. So there's a disconnect between who is collecting the information and who is defining the information and who in essence needs to benefit from these funds. So in those discussions, there are voices such as, again, it's always the same. It's young women, it's men and women from marginalized communities. It is persons from indigenous communities. It is disabled persons who are not being invited to give their unique perspectives to those high-level conversations. They can occur, but without data justice being taken into consideration, the outcomes of it, one, it won't get to the populations that it needs to get to, and two, we will find an unequal distribution of the resources that these funds hope to allocate, or they can go to those populations, but they are not going to address a culturally defined issue. What would I like to see more? Definitely increase data visualization and including young people, those same vulnerable groups within those data ecosystems within small island developing state regions. For instance, in the Caribbean, it's CARICOM statistics, and the only reason I got involved with them is because I cold messaged them and told them, hey, this is an issue, and they were all for it. So that's actually leading to what what you've asked me in terms of how can we do, or how can we advocate? I looked for the person, or I looked for the organization that I knew was collating that information. I said, hey, I would love to have a discussion. There are young people here who are passionate about data justice. We would like to have evidence-based advocacy, and you have the evidence. Let's see how we could collaborate. They're like, we're not good at this, this, and this. I say, well, that's excellent, because one of the things is like data visualization in social media, these things, making the information accessible that young people actually have the skills and the technologies to be able to do. So it's an intergenerational approach. It has to be a collaborative approach. It has to be both the technical and the practical coming together to be able to address the issue posed by the question.
That's a great answer. And I wonder, are there venues to which you think these voices are most importantly brought? Like where are they needed? Where do we find the gaps the widest?
I think if the gap is within, let me think about it. It's everywhere in terms of it affects all of those communities. There are women within these spaces, but there's also a need for women who are educated about climate crisis and data justice to be in those spaces. So I think the gap, if I had to put it into a small group or a group of persons who would probably help advance this cause, that group would probably look like a group of marginalized persons who are well educated about climate justice and the institutions that deal with it, and are employed, like formally employed, not just volunteering or speaking, but they're actively employed in the day-to-day operations of these institutions to assist them in ensuring that their frameworks match our current situation and are not just based in what we read about or what we hear about after the fact. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. I'm really trying to think sort of what is the advocacy agenda that we put forward. And I think there are multiple dimensions to that. So I really appreciate that degree of specificity. I know you may need to get off soon. The question I wanted to pose to both of you, perhaps to conclude, was just around data accuracy and whether we're worried that there's going to be flaws in data that will do many of either the non-economic loss and damage assessments, whether it will not take into account the kinds of disaggregation that bring in the differentiated needs of Indigenous people with disabilities, youth leaders, women, and girls. what are your concerns there and what are the remedies? And that's for both of you. Maybe Tahila, you could go first.
Yeah, I think my genuine concern is, well, recently we were at a conference, and one of the things that they brought up is post COVID-19, there's an apprehension to give the Central Statistical offices and the data collectors information. So as something as simple as a census, people are so secluded with what they want to share. So we have a brand new hurdle now in front of us where vulnerable communities who have faced an increased level of vulnerability in COVID-19 are now fearful to interact with the institutions that need to get that information from them. So I think rebuilding that relationship between those vulnerable communities and officials is really the beginning of everything else, because then the data gaps that already affect them are just carded to get wider. So that's the first step, rebuilding those relationships, rebuilding trust, which is increasingly relevant in this age of data privacy and data and sharing of information, rebuilding those systems, improving knowledge management systems, reflecting safe, strong, dependable institutions within the different territories and regionally, of course, could really help us begin that journey to closing that data gap, or at least prevent it from getting wider.
I think that loss of trust is a really important thing to flag, right? Because it creates a real vicious cycle, right? You don't call on these folks, they feel a sense of loss, they don't believe in the government and the people who are collecting data, and so they know they opt out. Really important point. Marissa, what would you say about issues with reliability of data and its comprehensiveness?
Yeah, I think that that issue is crucially important, and it is perhaps more frequently invoked in the case of non-economic loss and damage, because by their very nature, that kind of loss and damage tends to is not easily recorded using readily available units. Okay, so as I think I alluded to earlier in my intervention, we don't have very good standardized measurements for most of the items that would be included here. And so the traditional economic cost-benefit analysis that we have applying in other spheres are not always directly applicable. However, and that is important because we are talking about a transboundary kind of a situation, and efforts are being made to come up with some kind of standardized approach that would be universally applicable. And so there's this tension between what is locally relevant, locally specific, and what is globally important and potentially standardized. On the other hand, I don't think that we need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. The loss and damage fund is, it's very early days in terms of having a better understanding of how it's going to operate, and what are the various steps that are involved in implementing it. But we have parallel situations, parallel contexts from which helpful information can be gathered. And I'm referring to the fields of development-induced displacement, as well as the field of disaster risk reduction. In both of those fields, which are much, much older than loss and damage, decisions have been made, some more successful than others, that require taking into consideration not just the tangible, concrete, monetized economic disruption resulted from either a disaster that has already struck or the forced displacement of people. In the case of a developing project, most commonly the building of a dam. Okay, and so a lot of information has already been collected in terms of what happens to the people experiencing these types of situation. What needs to be accounted for, which is not just the material quantifiable kinds of issues, but as well as the cultural dimensions, the non-economic dimensions that are part and parcel of their resiliency. And I think that some of those lessons learned, sometimes learned the hard way, should be examined and by qualified extension, perhaps incorporated into a more refined and more specific set of standards that could be applied in the loss and damage realm as well. So I think it's a matter of, balancing the need for universal standardized approaches with the need for being context specific and culturally responsive to the particular situation of the various regions and communities that are being affected by loss and damage.
Thanks so much, Marissa. What I really appreciate about this conversation as a whole is the juxtaposition of a technical conversation about how we move the agenda forward through our analysis and our approach to costing risk and vulnerability, with a call to action in terms of bringing the voices forward of different groups, and to have them really talk in the ways Tahila speaks so persuasively about the need to focus on non-economic loss and damage, the need to focus on the differentiated needs of Indigenous people, of women, of people with disability and other marginalized groups. I would close out with a final question to you, Marissa, which is, if you had to prioritize something to move on nearest term, to advance a focus on this suite of issues, which is really not receiving enough attention, as was implicit in the question, at formal highest levels, what would you prioritize? What's the single most important thing to get more progress around this set of issues?
Well, this could be perhaps my own personal bias, but what I would recommend, and not necessarily or definitely not at the exclusion of everything else, but I would recommend more intersectional gender approach. We can move forward effectively and sustainably and equitably if we are leaving at least half of the population affected by anything behind. And so I'm emphasizing intersectional because it's not, although in my own comments, I've emphasized the situation of women and girls. Gender is just one dimension of the multiple components that make up people's position in society that in turn affect the way they are being impacted by any event or process, as well as their ability to contribute to finding solutions. And so I think I would begin by ensuring that nobody is left behind, as indicated in the title of the presentation, and that not leaving anyone behind requires making sure that intersectional gender kind of considerations are meaningfully and effectively incorporated into any kind of discussion. And that I particularly like the label intersectional gender, but because it encompasses everything that we have been discussing during this presentation. The non-economic kinds of circumstances that tend to be more relevant to, in many cases, women and girls living in the global South, whose contribution to community survival and well-being is not necessarily monetized and may be at risk of not being considered if the standards we come up with are exclusively technocratic and monetized. And so, yeah, let's not leave anyone behind. And that requires incorporating meaningful participation and meaningful inclusion of intersectional gender considerations. I would begin there.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a perfect place for us to finish. Please join me in thanking Marissa and Paula and Tahila for a really compelling discussion, and our colleague Christina Vetter for having put together a wonderful event. Have a lovely day, everybody. Enjoy the conference. Thank you so much for having joined the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security today.